What is up, YouTube? It is your boy Kage, and before this video starts, I just want to say that Shinobi Story is a lit game, and I'm never getting into closed access. So this is why I made this video, just to go over my depression and why I'm never getting into closed access. So in this video, I'm going to be doing, I'm going to be saying Shinobi Story 2,000 times. Now, if I get lazy, I might just loop it after I do 1,000, but I'm probably not gonna do that. For any people that make it to the end, yeah, make sure to subscribe because of my depression. Next time I'll do it 3,000 times for another game, but yeah. Here we go. Shinobi story, 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 Shinobi story. Oh, okay. Shinobi story, 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 Shinobi story. Shinobi story, 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 Shinobi stories, Shinobi story, 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 Shinobi Shinobi story, 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 shinobi story. Shinobi story, shinobi story, shinobi story. Shinobi story, shinobi story, shinobi story. Shinobi stories, shinobi stories, shinobi story. Shinobi stories, shinobi stories, shinobi story. Shinobi stories, shinobi stories, shinobi story. Shinobi story, shinobi story, 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 shinobi story. Shinobi stories, shinobi stories, shinobi story. Shinobi stories, shinobi stories, shinobi story. Shinobi story, shinobi story, 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 shinobi hori story. Shinobi story, shinobi story, shinobi shinobi story. Shinobi story, shinobi story, 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 shinobi story. Shinobi story, 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 shinobi story. Shinobi story, 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 shinobi story. 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 Shinobi story, shinobi story. Shinobi story, 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 shinobi story. Shinobi story, 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 shinobi story. Shinobi story, 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 shinobi story. Shinobi story, 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 shinobi story. Shinobi story, 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 shinobi story. Shinobi story, 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 shinobi story. Shinobi story, 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 shinobi story. Shinobi story, 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 shinobi story. Shinobi story, 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 shinobi story. Oh crap! I broke my pitch counter. Shinobi story, 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 shinobi story. Shinobi story, 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 shinobi story. Shinobi story, 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 shinobi story. Shinobi story, shinobi story, shinobi story, shinobi story, shinobi story, shinobi story, shinobi story. Yo, shinobi story, 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 shinobi story. Shinobi story, 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 shinobi story. Shinobi story, 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 Shinobi story. Shinobi story, 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 shinobi story. Shinobi story, 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 shinobi story. Shinobi story, 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 shinobi story. Shinobi story, 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 shinobi story. Shinobi story, 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 shinobi story. Shinobi story, 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 story, shinobi story, shinobi story, shinobi story. Shinobi story, 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 shinobi story. Shinobi story, 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 shinobi story. Shinobi story, 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 story, shinobi 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 stories, shinobi story, shinobi stories, shinobi story story. She's gonna shinobi story, 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 shinobi story. You can shinobi story, shinobi story, shinobi story, shinobi story. Shinobi story, 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 shinobi story. Shinobi story, 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 shinobi story. Shinobi story, 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 shinobi stories, shinobi stories, shinobi stories, shinobi story, 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 shinobi story. Shinobi story, shinobi trunk, shinobi story, 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 shinobi story. Shinobi story, 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 should I give you shinobi story, 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 so shinobi story, shinobi story, shinobi story, shinobi stream, shinobi story, shinobi stories, shinobi story, shinobi story, shinobi story, shinobi story. Shinobi story, 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 shinobi story. Shinobi story, 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 shinobi shinobi story, 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 shinobi story. Shinobi story, 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 shinobi towers, shinobi story, 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 shinobi story. Shinobi story, shinobi story, shinobi story, shinobi story, shinobi story, shinobi story. 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 Shinobi story, shinobi story, shinobi story. Shinobi story, 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 shinobi story, shinobi story, story, shinobi story. Shinobi story, shinobi story, shinobi story, what shinobi story? Shinobi story, shinobi story, shinobi story, shinobi story, shinobi shinobi story, 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 shinobi story. Shinobi story, 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 shinobi story. Shinobi story, 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 Shinobi story. Thank you for watching, and if you made it to this point, please subscribe. Any friends? Goodbye.